Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John Spink, and I'm the head of the Crops, Environment and Land Use in Teagasc. And I'd like to welcome you to this, the second of our series of webinars looking at issues around land use. In the first webinar a fortnight ago, we outlined in general terms some of the demands that we make of land in terms of production, but also ecosystem services, and also some of the complexity in terms of how decisions on land use are influenced. So in this second webinar, we're going to look at some of the issues in relation to production. And this morning we have three presenters. We have Niall Farrelly, who will talk to you about issues around land use in relation to forestry. Ewan Mullins, who will talk to you about crops, and in particular tillage and horticultural crops. And then last but not least, we have Elodie Ruel, who will talk to you about issues around grassland and grassland production in Ireland. Before we move on to the first speaker, after the three speakers have presented, we will have 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A session. And if you could put questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, I'll go through those at the end. It would be very useful if you could say which of the speakers you're addressing with your question, although I think it might be fairly obvious given the range of subjects that they're talking about. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Niall Farrelly, who will talk to you about issues around land use for forestry. Thanks, Niall.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Niall Farrelly. I work with Teagasc here in Athenry. I'm involved in working in land use and forestry. I'm going to talk to you about how we're going to make the most of our land from forestry with the multiple demands on land in terms of sustainable development and land use. First of all, I'm going to cover a historical perspective of forestry in Ireland, where we've come from and where we're going to. And then I'm going to cover the why, what, where questions, why we should plant, what we should plant, and where we're going to plant this resource and what benefits it's going to provide us into the future. To start off with, I want to just bring us back quite a bit period in time, just the period of the Ice Age. I think it's highly relevant to where we've come from in forestry for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that we had the development of soils in Ireland after the Ice Age, and also we had the tree species which were available to us were quite limited after the Ice Age. People might be familiar that the ice sheet covered most of Northern Europe after the Ice Age. This gradually melted 12,000 years ago, and we were left with the island as we know it today. Sea levels rose, of course, and we were left with a barren, mostly like tundra environment. This area had its challenges in terms of the tree species that were available. We had the evolution of woodland development across the landscape on this barren tundra over time. It took about 1,000 years, in effect, to create a very scrubby type vegetation after the tundra. And then we developed into more pioneer woodland as tree species became, the climate changed a little bit, tree species became more adaptable, and then we developed into different types of tree species such as pine, the drier areas of the country, elm in the more fertile midland areas, and ultimately we developed towards climax vegetation. And climax vegetation is, for Ireland, for example, is oak. Over time, at this period of we had 80% tree cover in Ireland, probably around 6,000 years ago. We know all of this, of course, from pollen analysis. There has been various pollen analysis studies from sediment cores, which are available to researchers, and they find the amount of pollen available in those sediment cores over time. So as you go back in time, you see a lot of tree pollen. And then we also know that the trees underwent a significant proportion of clearance around 5,000 BC in Ireland. We know that this clearance took place due to ancient settlers. We had the Neolithic settlers in Ireland, which cleared land for a variety of uses. The uses could have been for growing crops, animal providing dwelling spaces, etc. Trees were felled for charcoal production, for fire, for shelter, etc. We also had a period during the 9th century where monastic settlements, which are intensification of tree removal, and of course a more modernization of agriculture, field systems, and more intensification. And ultimately, we had the period of the forest clearance during the Tudor times, around 1600. We had about 15% forest cover in Ireland. This was further reduced owing to the exportation and exploitation of the resources for boat building, over to exported coopering, charcoal production, etc. So by the turn of the 1900s in Ireland, we had a forest cover somewhere in the region of 1%, very low. There was initial efforts to try and re-establish some forest cover by the Avondale Initiative in 1905, trying to find out what species are more suitable for reforesting the country. And well, at the foundation of the Irish Free State in 1920, a progress of afforestation of this land took place again. At this time, we probably had somewhere in the region of 100,000 hectares of trees and forests in Ireland, and the afforestation was primarily aimed. It was quite slow initially, actually. It was somewhere in the region of a couple of 100 hectares for the first 10 years. It was supported by some limited grants available to owners, but it was mainly larger private owners which have availed of this. The state forestry programme really started in earnest with targets with the Forestry Act in the late 1940s, and we see a dramatic increase in state planting from the 1940s onwards. And this land, afforestation was limited to land which wasn't really fit for agricultural production. So the land that was forested was challenging, to say the least. Nevertheless, in this period, we had a period of about 6,000 hectares per year being planted between the period 1956 and 83, relatively successful. The forest cover had then, by that stage, increased to about 400,000. However, during the mid-1980s, there was a problem with land, effectively, and getting land for forestry. So there was a change in policy, a policy aimed at encouraging more agricultural land or more marginal type land into forestry. And we had the Western Package Scheme, which came in 1986, followed by operational program schemes, etc. And we saw a dramatic increase in the amount of forestry being planted. We saw somewhere in the region of 10,000 hectares being achieved for multiple years during the late 90s and early 2000s. And the forest cover increased substantially in that period of time. We now have 770,000 hectares, or 11% of the land area. And why this is very relevant is because all of that new forestry, of course, has climate change benefits. I will talk about that in a few subsequent slides. If we look at the land type that's available for forestry in Ireland, we see, very much the distinctive land which was traditionally planted for forestry in Ireland, which is the forestry land, as I call it. In here, you've got, you can try and make the best of it in terms of your species choice and selection, and you've species which really are tolerant of exposure, harsher climatic conditions, and more challenging soil types, upland areas, etc. And then when we look at the forestry which has been planted owing to the private forestry program, we've got an opportunity for further diversification into a more wider range of species, but also the potential exists to increase yields. The land is a much better quality. We're getting much higher yielding crops, shorter rotations, more profitable for farmers, and also higher rates of carbon sequestration available on this land. I think it's very relevant in terms of where we're going with climate change in the future. The question has arisen why we should plant more land in Ireland. Well, we have evidence of forest cover in Ireland, as I've alluded to in my earlier slides, but we also have evidence of forestry throughout the landscape. If you look closely enough, you'll find stumps from previous forests. Cage of Fields is an example. But we also have one of the lowest forest covers in Europe. The EU average is about 33%. We have 11% in Ireland, as I said earlier on. There's economic benefits and there's options for land use for farmers who want to consider an alternative enterprise. And of course, there's ecosystem service benefits and there's recreation benefits. So there's multitude of benefits from that forestry can deliver and supply as a land use option in Ireland. I want to talk about one of the main drivers for afforestation in Ireland, and that's forestry and carbon. And as we all know, that forests can capture and store carbon very well. They're been mentioned throughout climate change mitigation. And effectively, forests work by sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And also the benefit for society is we can get oxygen from these trees. We see in the news about the Amazon forest being deforested, but they're the lungs of the planet effectively. They give society or the human population the oxygen. The carbon is then stored in both the trees above ground and also in the forest soils. There's a vast amount of carbon stored in the forest soils. It's by far the largest pool of carbon stored in Irish forests. And why all this is relevant is because it gives us an opportunity to be able to make a contribution to mitigate climate change or carbon, to be able to sequester that carbon from the atmosphere. I think it's been well acknowledged, and the Teagasc MAC curve is an illustration of the benefits of forests can provide to that carbon dioxide sequestration and mitigation. The MAC curve on my right here on the slide here is showing the contribution which forestry can make to that carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And because the forestry is such a large block there, it is by far one of the largest areas which can contribute as part of land use change, but it also has quite a low cost. The cost there in that graph is somewhere in the region of €50 a tonne. We talk about we need to plant more forestry in Ireland. We hear targets in the media. We hear targets from policymakers, 8,000 hectares per year for climate action plan. Where are we going to find this land, or what's the most suitable land? We've multiple land use objectives and competing for different land resources. I was involved in a study a couple of years ago where we looked at the land that was suitable for forestry, and again, it is quite a complex issue, and it involves modelling agronomy and understanding of what the soils can deliver, etc. We start off on a blank canvas, which is this land area of Ireland, which is 7 million hectares, and we go through an iteration of removal of land which is not suitable for forestry. We then arrive at a final figure of what is suitable for forestry. So we go through an iteration of removing watercourses, development land, etc. And then we look at the conservation areas that we have to conserve, Natura areas, Harrier areas, etc. And we go through a process of deducting the land. We're left with a pool of land which is more suitable for forestry. The area that's not suitable for planting is somewhere in the region of 45% of the land area, 3.24 million hectares. And the area that's most suitable for planting is somewhere in the region of 3.75 million hectares. Now, as I said earlier on, this land, while it's suitable for planting, it is also suitable for a range of land uses and for agriculture, development land, intensification or sustainable production. We are incredibly good at growing grass in Ireland, and we're incredibly good at producing milk, etc. And we have multiple competing land uses. So if we look at the climate smart type of model for land use, this is just one area we can look at. We look at the productive land in Ireland, which is likely to maintain the focus of food production. There's a variety of options for that land, which can be from animal production, for dairy production, horticultural production, of course, development land, etc. So there's multiple demands on that type of land. So when we remove that type of highly productive land from that 3.75 million hectares, we're left with a pool of land which is 1.3 million hectares. That land is composed of 3 soil quality classes, an extremely limited soil quality class, a very limited soil quality class, and a limited soil quality class. The 2 former soil quality classes are quite limited. They're limited by rocky terrain, altitude, and slopes. They're not the prime areas where you would consider productive forestry or forestry for sequestering carbon. So we're left with a limited area which has poor drainage. It's quite a sizable block of land. It's 820,000 hectares.
I already have 1 minute left.
Okay, John, thanks. What are the soils in this area? Well, the soils are predominantly mineral soils. They're glade soils, pod soils, and there's a proportion of very good soils, brown earths. So the options on these areas are quite diverse. We can plant a range of species in different areas at a landscape level to deliver all of those ecosystem services, economic production, and carbon sequestration. Okay. So finally, just to finish, I want to thank you for your attention, but I just want to dwell on a picture here, which was a tree planted in Avondale Forest in 1905. Originally, it was planted at a time when climate change wasn't even on the radar, and without planting these trees at that period of time, we wouldn't be able to derive the benefits in terms of the multifunctional benefits of forestry. So I think, you know, we have to act now and make those decisions for the benefits of future society. I'd like to thank you for your attention this morning, and I will try to answer questions later in the session. Thank you.
Niall, just before you go, there is one question that we might answer now, and someone's just asking from your slide with the map of suitable land, is green or orange the suitable land that you had on the map?
Green, the green is the suitable map, orange is the area which is not suitable for planting.
Thanks, Niall. We'll come back to the other questions after. Okay, now maybe if you could just stop sharing the screen and we'll hand over to Ewan Mullins, who's going to talk about issues in relation to production of crops, and that's particularly tillage and horticultural crops. Thanks, Ewan.
Okay, John. I'll just share screen. Okay, so good morning, everybody. As John said, I'm going to give some insight in terms of crop productivity now. And speaking about crops, it's in the broadest sense, both tillage and horticultural. And in regard to the horticultural, I want to acknowledge the contributions and content and slides given by my colleague Dermot Callahan, who heads up the Horticulture Development Department in Ashtown. So our current crop sector covers approximately 300,000 hectares. And if you drew an imaginary line from the northeast down to west of Cork, it's primarily concentrated east of that line, although of course there's also important areas in North Donegal. The economic impact of the sector as a whole, based on Michael Wallace's assessments earlier this year, quantified to approximately 1.3 billion for the crop sector. The horticultural sector, approximately 500 million. But as you can see from the figures there, thousands of jobs, direct jobs and also indirect jobs, basically underlining the importance of the sector to the Irish economy. So while this image is an image of a snapshot of current crop acreage, what's insightful is work done by Jessica Zemmerman and Rob O'Hara of the Spatial Analysis Unit in Ashtown earlier this year, which was published in Teagasc Research. And what they looked at was townlands with reference to agriculture in the name, so be they arable land or crop types. And of course, there's a caveat here. This is over 150 years ago, relating to land use 150 years ago. And what you can see, obviously, is that it's a rough proxy, but also it gives us some valuable insights into the potential to develop particular crop types and potential land use into the future. Of course, every sector has its challenges. Niall talked about some for forestry. Elodie will talk about some for grassland after myself, but for ourselves in crop production and in all plant production in Ireland, we are blessed by our climate that may seem quite a bizarre statement at times, but that maritime climate we get coming off the Atlantic provides adequate rain, humidity, and good mild temperatures to maximize yields. However, with that climate, it also brings its own challenges, and particularly in the last couple of years where our climate has become more volatile, we have fluctuating weather patterns. And what this is doing, particularly in regard to some insects, and here this little fella, the grain aphid, is overwintering at greater numbers. And as a result, we're seeing a greater incidence of BYDV, which is barley yellow dwarf virus, on our cereal crops, because he is a vector for virus transfer. Of course, to control diseases, we're reliant on PPPs, which are plant protection products, be they fungicides, insecticides, or herbicides. And if we don't use those chemicals, what we get are the images in the bottom of the slide. On the left, we have Septoria, a dominant disease of winter wheat, and on the right, Ramularia and also Rhynchosporium, important diseases of barley. Also, we have high need to use PPPs on potato production. This is a field in North Dublin where there was an issue with the application of the fungicide, and the presence of late blight is constant through the growing season of potato. So obviously, if you don't spray, you will get potato blight, and it will impact on yield and quality. Other challenges we see are in regard to competing for land access. Against, for example, we obviously have dairy expansion at the moment, and that drives up land prices, land rental prices. It's also important to note, of course, the commodities produced within the crop sector, both tillage and horticulture, are traded on international benchmarked prices. And within the EU, obviously, we develop and produce crops to a very high standard in line with EU legislation. But outside of Europe, competitors which are importing material into Ireland obviously have access to breeding technologies that we in Europe are not able to access at this moment. So there is a competitive disadvantage there. Within the horticultural sector itself, one of the primary issues is providing technical support for opportunities across the sector that is so diverse. So, for example, as Dermot has listed here, of 160 growers, the top 30 are providing over 75% of the output. There's an industry of large growers, obviously dealing with the multiples, but then there's a very important cohort of growers that provide into local markets and regional outlets. And in addition to that, there's an expanding interest in organic production and meeting the certification for that. Kevin Hanrahan 2 weeks ago showed a very interesting slide from a book, Kennedy and Solar, published in 2007. But really, the sentence that here is it's so important really in regard to land use into the future, because really land use is determined by changes in the profitability of the types of farming that are there. So with that in mind, how can we add value? What are the particular crops that we can focus on to develop and support through research here in Teagasc and with our partners and collaborators, so that we can add value to the farmer and into the whole value chain for the processors and ultimately benefit the consumer? So let me touch on a few examples. Back in 2008, we were importing approximately 2 million tons of animal feed to support our livestock sector. That's chicken, pigs, and beef and dairy. In 2018, that exceeded 4 million tons. So as a result, our self-sufficiency at the moment is approximately 20%. So for every 5 tons of animal feed we use on this land, we are only producing 1 ton of that domestically. Obviously, this highlights possible some vulnerabilities in regard to authenticity and traceability, but for ourselves within the cropping sector, this also raises an opportunity for import substitution. Obviously, we have to be realistic. We're not going to be able to displace all of the imports, but there is an opportunity to substitute a percentage of it, and hopefully an increasing percentage, with domestically sourced protein. And an excellent crop that could meet this is faba bean or field bean. It's an important break crop in the cereal rotation, but it also has a fantastic ability to fix nitrogen due to the presence of bacteria on the roots, which fix nitrogen from the air and effectively producing a self-made fertilizer for the crop. The protein area has increased since 2015 by over 100%. And while there are agronomic issues in terms of yield variability, as Sheila Alves, a colleague in Oak Park, pointed out in a survey of bean growers recently, the yield trend, as you see here, can vary quite a lot from about 1.9 up to 7.6. So while the average of about 5 tons per hectare may seem reasonable, that variability needs to be addressed over time. So the potential to double the protein area does actually exist within our current tillage area. And to support this even more, Teagasc has recently started a multi-institutional partner project led by Mark Fenlon called U-Protein. Ourselves and Crops are involved in it, and food, rural economy, and agriculture. And the idea of the U-Protein is to basically unlock and exploit the potential of existing crop biomass. So at the moment, we're producing crops for the livestock sector, the drinks industry, but the goal of U-Protein is to see, can we get more from what we're already producing? Can we exploit the resources, be they cereals, pastures, etc., and through downstream processing, can we increase the value? And ultimately that will benefit the consumer, but of course the goal as well is to give added premium to the farmers and the ultimate producers. Looking towards grains, obviously oats, which in the 1800s was the biofuel of the country, had a vastly larger acreage than we have now. But at the moment we produce about 50,000 tons, and oats itself has increased in popular consumption, primarily due to the link of beta-glucans to reduce cholesterol levels. And we actually export 10,000 tons, and that demand is increasing. So there is potential, obviously, to increase the role of oats in our rotations. And oats, while a cereal, is also an important break crop between the standard wheat production, reduces take-all disease. Rye is also an important animal feed. Our colleague Peter Lauder has recently shown the potential of rye as a feed supplement in pig feed. It's a low input crop and also has potential as a raw material for the drinks industry. Now we know obviously the drinks industry is extremely important for the economy with very significant export values. The Irish cropping sector produces about 300,000 tons of grain, and that is extremely important for the export trade. But in recent years, what's become significant is the exploitation of the terroir properties of Irish grains. So again, it's emphasizing that locally sourced produced material driven by the marketing of authenticity as well. And that's an important area that we can add value as well to producers. Oils, cold pressed rapeseed oil, very familiar with the yellow fields in the spring and summer across the Irish landscape. Increasing in prominence and recognition because of its nutritional properties are actually higher than extra virgin olive oil due to the presence of omega oils and vitamin E. Current production estimated about 5,320,000 litres, but there is real potential to expand that. And again, oilseed rape gives diversity into our current rotations and has to be welcomed. As well as when you press the oil out of the seed, that residual cake is not a waste. It can also be used as an important animal feed. Switching to horticulture, the images we have here are all produce that we're very familiar with. But the figures underneath each one of these relates to the amount that we import every year into Ireland. For example, for dessert apples, we import 62,000 tons, which actually is 95% of our current consumption. And obviously the importation of potatoes was in the news during the week with the impending challenges of Brexit. We're importing about 72,000 tons of potatoes into Ireland to meet certain sectoral demands. But obviously we're very good at producing potatoes, and this is something that we can displace into the future. Focusing on the dessert apple market, as I said, 95% are imported. That value to market is 135 million, but there is an opportunity to produce another 30,000 tons. And the figures that Dermot has provided in terms of the value of the crop at over 25,000 euro per hectare indicates real potential to expand this as well. And of course, being trees, as Niall has talked about, there's a carbon sequestration potential by expanding our orchards. The production of controlled environment agriculture, or simply greenhouse production, while obviously capital intensive because it's a physical structure, the opportunities is that you can grow a range of horticultural soft fruits and vegetables in glasshouse or CEA facilities. Our current production, while it may seem quite nominal at 25 hectares, when you see the output that produces at over 25 million, again, it's significant. One of the benefits, of course, is that there's increased potential for water and nutrient use efficiency, and you're getting a more sustainable, reduced land use and improved use efficiency as well. So to attain our future goals, we need to be exploiting the available tools that we have. So Farm to Fork is the EU's strategy to reduce inputs and improve the sustainability of food production across the community. To do that, they have set goals that by 2030, we have to reduce the use of plant protection products by 50% and fertilizer inputs by 20%. So to do that, well, quite frankly, how are we going to do that? Well, durable sources of genetic resistance, basically solid, durable varieties that farmers know and have the confidence will have resilience to resist abiotic and biotic stresses, are going to be key. However, we have to accelerate the development and breeding of this material. So the crosses being made this year will produce the varieties of 2030. So the material that is on the shelf now has to have the potential to deliver the varieties we need in 2030. But the problem is it takes about 10 years to produce a variety, it said about 12 to 13 years for a potato variety. And one of the challenges with potatoes we saw earlier is the presence of late blight. This is the 175th anniversary of the occurrence of late blight in the famine period, and it hasn't gone away. We still have to spray, and this is an image of a plot taken in Oak Park by a drone of a variety called Desiree. And as you can see, there's very little foliage on the potato plants because late blight has effectively blitzed the plot, and yield would be reduced by about 20–30% or even more. In a project we were working on recently with EU partners, the Amiga project, partners in that project took a gene from a wild potato and spliced it into the DNA of this variety, a single gene that produced a single protein that made the variety Desiree resistant to late blight. That one single action delivered that new material, this Desiree line, in approximately 6 months to 12 months out into the field. So what that technique is doing is accelerating the breeding strategy. And as a result, the environmental footprint was reduced by over 90%. So while Farm to Fork is asking us to attain goals of 50%, using accelerated breeding strategies, that can actually be exceeded. There was no negative impact on soil biodiversity, be they bacteria, fungi, nematodes, earthworms, or above ground insects as well. But the key thing here we have to remember is that if we are going to integrate genetics and more durable varieties, it must come with tailored management strategies. So we know from any disease, be it a fungal disease of plants, COVID, any viral disease, that all those pathogens have the ability to evolve, and they will, because of course they're being challenged by new resistance or new therapeutics. So by the strategic deployment of genetic varieties, it is possible to deliver new varieties. So in summary, our cropping systems are key for the sustainability of the ag-food industry. However, what is important is the diversity of crops so that we can lessen the risk across the rotation. Strong consumer interest, as everybody will know, is highlighting the interest in plant-based diets. Tillage production in Ireland, crop production has a low greenhouse gas footprint, approximately 1.1 tons of carbon equivalent per hectare. And that's in contrast to beef at around 4.4 and dairy above 8. So these are important factors that will drive a further focus on sustainability, authenticity, and provenance. So ultimately, we can deliver significant opportunities, higher value markets, and add value for the producer. So I'll end by just a collage of pictures taken from Oak Park and Ashtown. And I want to give thanks to all the people who have contributed to the talk in providing pictures and information. And obviously my email and Dermot's email is there if anybody has follow-on questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ewan. Maybe you could stop sharing your screen. I'll just remind people we've got a good number of questions coming in. But if you want to ask Ewan or Niall, or indeed Elodie, who's coming next, any questions, just put your questions onto the Q&A and we'll come back to them at the end. Okay, Elodie, I'll hand over to you to talk about Grassland. Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Elodie Ruel and I'm here to talk to you about grassland in Ireland. So we'll start to talk a small bit about what's grass in Ireland, how much grass there is, and what's the idea behind the most grazing system in Ireland. Then we'll go to the variabilities that there is in terms of grass growth and grass production in Ireland. And then we'll go to some challenges that we will have in the future and some hopefully solution we can get to. So grassland in Ireland. So I guess if you go abroad and you speak about Ireland, people see that as a green country, and it's the green country. And it's not only because of the jersey of its red-beak team, but it's also because there's grass everywhere and everything is green. So Ireland, in Europe anyway, is the most grassland-based country. But even if you look a bit in the full world, I guess, take out New Zealand, it's probably still, it is one of the most grassland-based country. 80% of the agricultural area, it's either on pasture, on hay, on grass silage, or either pasture to feed directly the animal, or transforming that grass to be able still to feed the animals. And in terms of input, so in terms of other feed you would feed to those animals, compared to other countries in the world, the input, so we'll say the concentrate, or the other forage, which are not grass-based, are relatively low. Most of the diet of the animal in Ireland are grass-based. And what is the Irish grazing system? What is its characteristic? So first of all, as you can see on that graph, that's the shape of the grass growth curve during the year, in an average grass growth curve in Ireland, which is fairly typical. And what you can see, its grass start to grow properly from mid-February and stop around mid-November. So basically, it kind of grows for the full year. And the big difference that we have with most other European countries is that in that part around June, July, it's still growing a lot. Than in those countries, it would be decreasing a lot due to the proper summers they have, because it's way warmer and there would be a drought at that time. Then in Ireland, grass keep growing at those times. And I guess in a lot of European countries also, the big difference would be at the shoulder of the year, because the winter could be also colder than here, so which means, and there could be snow way earlier. Well, there could be snow over there, and that would stop the grass growth earlier in the year, and the restart of the growing season will be later on. So main point here, in Ireland, we have an extended grazing season from February to November, and that's not every country, well, almost no other country have that. And everything is based, it's a comparison between demand of a herd. So what do you need to feed your animals, and grass growth. So it's a balance between demand and grass growth. And the blue line I have added here, it's a typical demand in kilogram of dry matter of grass per hectare you would need to feed an average dairy herd. And what you can see, if you compare that to the grass growth, is you have two periods. So you have the shoulder, which are there of the year, where you have a deficit and you don't have enough grass to feed all your animals. And in the main grazing season, there's actually a surplus. So you're growing more than what you need to feed your animal. So the idea behind all that is during your surplus time to create silage, to cut that grass, to be able to feed it back during the deficit period. But what we need to remember is we are trying to put as much grass directly into the animal, so as grazing, and as little as possible transform as silage, and if possible, not too much concentrate either. And why is that? It's because the graze grass is actually very cheap feed to give the animal. And the relative cost of graze grass compared to grass silage, so grass silage is 1.9 times more expensive because you have to grow the grass and then cut it, transform it, and store it. Concentrate is 2.9 times more expensive than graze grass, and then forage crop is an average 1.8 times more expensive than graze grass. So if you can put as much grass directly into the animal, you will win more money at the end. And another study we did here would show that sorry, I don't have the number for sheep farm, but every additional ton of grass eaten per hectare will increase profit on beam farm by 105 euro per hectare and on dairy farm by 181 euro per hectare. So if you think about a farm of 40 hectare, 100 hectare, I just let you do the calculation, but that's very valuable. But so what I showed just earlier was your average grass growth, well, with a fake curve, we'll say. And what is actually happening? So the line in black is your average grass growth for the 8 previous year. And that's data from Pasture Based Ireland, which is a management tool for farmers. So it's actually measured grass growth. It's not simulation, it's not anything like that. It's actually measured grass growth in Ireland. So you can see, so the black one, once again, is your average. And some years will follow very well. and some years not as well. And if you want to go back to the very poor year we have that I think everyone remembered, because it was a great year for human, but not very good for grass, which was 2018. So, sorry, there was a drought in summer, which almost never happened apart in 2013, but that's fairly rare here, but that would be normal for other countries now. You had the drought in summer that everyone remember, but you also, if you look at that, so that's the red line, 2018, and you can see that the start of the growing season actually started way later. So what that means is farmers had to feed way more silage than they would normally during the spring, but also that when normally we're in a time where you're growing more grass than what you need, they had to feed silage also, because actually there was not enough grass at that time. So that's not good for the silage stock for the following year. So just a point to make that not every year it's the same, and there will be variability. And that's very important to remember. Then that was just the average. So the graph are just for the average of the country. That's all data together. But then what we need to remember, it's also Ireland is just not one location. There's a lot of variability, and the map would just appear there. It's the Irish soil map of Ireland, and you can see there's different color into it. I'm not going to tell you what each color is, but each color does correspond to a different soil type series, so that different style of soil type, I could say. And you can see there's some region you have the black one, which is the peatland, and then you have some color by region. There's a bit of mix, but you can see some things there. So obviously you won't have the same soil type everywhere. But however, what we need to remember is everywhere in Ireland there is farms which are able to grow a lot of grass, and that's something we may not have known before having pasture-based Ireland. And I'm not saying that every farm in the country can grow a lot of grass, but there is part of the country where normally grass growth is not as good, but there's still going to be one or two farms, if you look in the west, northwest there, which will be able to grow still 12 ton or 14 ton, and that's great. But obviously there's going to be more. It will be easier if you're in the south, or if you're in the east, due to a mix between soil type and weather. And that's what we're going to go look into from now on. So we did an experiment, simulation. So now it's all simulated data. I'm going to show you using a model we developed here, where we wanted to see the impact of weather and soil type in two locations. So in Moorpark, which is where I'm at now, so more south, and in Ballyhaise, which is more north. And what we're going to look is two soil, a free draining soil, so which doesn't retain water that well, and an heavy soil, which retains water a lot. And what we're going to look at the average grass growth, that's the average of 16 years. We're going to look at how much grass goes directly into the cow. So grass intake, not silage, but grass intake per cow. And we're going to look at the number of days without silage feeding. So that means the number of days either the cow were out grazing and you didn't need it to feed them silage in top of grazing. So that means you had enough grass to feed them. So outdoor and enough grass on the farm to feed them. And if we look at that, we're going to first look at using the Moorpark weather and see the difference between the free draining soil and the heavy soil. First of all, grass growth. The heavy soil actually in both simulations grew 1.3 tons more than a farm with free draining soil. And that's because there was 3 years with drought in Moorpark, and the heavy soil were able during those drought to retain more water, so overall to grow more grass. But if you look at the grass intake per cow now, you can see that actually the cow in the farm with the heavy soil was eating less grass directly, even though the grass growth was higher. And why is that? It's not because you have grass on the farm that you can actually graze it straight away. It's because the heavy soil was retaining too much water. So there was a lot of time where actually the farmer had a lot of grass on his farm, which was ready for grazing, but he couldn't put the animal outside to graze that grass. And that's reflecting on the number of days without silage feeding, which was 13 days less in the heavy soil. And that's the same story. That's because there was grass out there, but he couldn't put a cow at grazing. Now, if we compare the same thing with the Bally haze weather, and we're going to look at just the free draining soil at first and compare Moor Park free draining soil with Bally haze free draining soil. So first of all, what we can say in terms of the average growth, they are the same. In average of 16 years, they were the same. If you could look on year by year, it would be different, but average of the 16 years for the total grass growth of the years, they were the same. The grass intake per cow was slightly higher in Bally haze, and the number of days without silage feeding was slightly higher in Bally haze also, and that's because they actually had less drought in Bally haze, a small bit more rainfall in the drought year compared to Moor Park. And if we compare with the heavy soil, that's the other way around. So the heavy soil in Bally haze was growing less grass. There was even a lower grass intake per cow compared to the heavy soil in Moor Park. And the number of days without silage feeding was decreased by 10 days. And why is that? It's because Bally haze had more rain. So in terms of, so that means that there was less day where the farmer could actually go grazing. So, and if we just compare quickly Bally haze, free draining soil and heavy soil, so higher growth for the heavy soil, less grass intake per cow, which is start to be very significant, and 34 less days at grazing without silage feeding for the heavy soil than the free draining soil. So that's a big difference. So my conclusion is on that slide would be, if you're free draining soil, you're probably better to be near Bally haze, and if you're an heavy soil, you're probably better to be near Moor Park. But sadly, I think it's more the other way around. Now, if we want to look at what the challenging main challenge are coming, or the one I'm more aware of anyway, it's everything around environment is going to be a big challenge coming to us. And obviously, everyone have heard about the greenhouse gases reduction that has to decrease worldwide. But one of the things which is going to hit us soon probably is water quality, and we have to start improving again water quality, and there will probably be a reduction of nitrogen. We may need to reduce nitrogen fertilizer of 20% in the coming year. And we did a nitrogen report where we did a lot of simulation for beef, dairy, and sheep. And if one of the main results we had for dairy is that if we had to reduce nitrogen of 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on a dairy farm, that would mean a reduction around 0.25 co per hectare. So that's very significant. And in terms of economics, that would mean 20% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use would lead to a reduction on net farm profit of 60% for sheep farm, 12% for beef farm, and 50% for dairy farm. So that's fairly significant. But before we all panic,
left, Elodie.
Yeah, perfect. Before we all panic, that's only if we change nothing. That's considering the farm stays the same way and the management stays the same way. But there is solution there. So one which is fairly vague, I may say, it's improving grass utilization. So that's just better grazing management and try to maximize the amount of grass which go from the paddock directly into the animal. Easy to say, not that easy to do. Then improving soil fertility. So if your soil is not perfect, if the soil fertility isn't perfect, that means that the amount of that means that the nitrogen you put is not used at its best. So that means that if you improve your soil fertility and decrease your nitrogen input, maybe you would be able to grow exactly the same thing. And the last point, which won't be that easy, but which will be very important, is to incorporate clover on farm, because you can grow as much grass with grass clover with less fertilizer can grow as much than grass with more fertilizer. So in conclusion, as I said already, Ireland is grass-based, and that's the most grassland-based country in Europe. So it's grass everywhere, but there is variability. We need to remember that. But grass is definitely the competitive advantage compared to the European country, because it's growing for the full year than in other countries. It would be lower grass growth in summer and probably lower grass growth during the winter. And I've shown very quickly some challenges, but there's solution, and we're working on finding more solution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elodie. I might ask the other presenters to turn their video and their microphones back on. We've got a good few questions in already, but if you would like to ask a question, please just add it at the bottom. We've got time for a few questions anyway. There's a few questions for you, and I'm going to put some of them together. The first one was, what was the gene that was spliced into the potato to give resistance? And then a couple of questions saying, once that happened, does it make it a genetically modified organism?
Okay, so the gene was called VNT1. It was taken from the wild potato Solanum venturii. And yes, according to EU regulations and directives, that does make it technically a GMO, yes.
Is there any likelihood that that would change in the near future, Ewan?
So I think at the moment, as in the next year or two, no, I wouldn't see any change there. I think the real discussion has to be around the next generation of breeding techniques, in particular precision breeding or gene editing. So the European Court of Justice recently declared that while a form of mutagenesis, that it was to be considered a GMO. Now this was contrary to evidence and reports produced by multiple scientific agencies across Europe. But if we park that for the moment, I suppose the context of this is really the challenges we have in the next 10 years. If we're going to attain the farm to fork goals, we have to have a serious conversation, and we have to examine carefully the potential of breeding techniques. Obviously, techniques that have to be proven to be safe. That is the key step there. And based on the research here in Oak Park and the Amiga project, that particular step with potato had no negative impact on the environmental metrics we studied.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question here, which I think is probably aimed at Niall and perhaps Elodie, maybe Ewan as well. Do you think that agroforestry, and particularly silvopasture, so that's trees and grassland, is a viable land use option to mitigate and adapt for climate change while continuing to produce animal products? Niall, maybe you'd go first.
Yeah, my presentation, can you hear me? Yeah. My presentation covered, the commercial productive, but also timber producing areas. I didn't cover the productive land element, but certainly agroforestry is a method of encouraging trees onto the farm in better areas, which may have some role in mitigation some of the farm level emissions. I quite like the idea Ewan was talking about the apples. I always felt that if we could use agroforestry not only for the timber production, but for the fruit, nuts production, that we could have a perennial crop growing that would be providing apples, and we'd have the multitude of the benefits on the farm. So yeah, I think there are plenty of opportunities with agroforestry, and possibly an opportunity to encourage trees onto the farm.
Okay, Elodie, I don't know whether you have any experience of agroforestry at all.
Not really, no. So it's starting to be a bit out of my league there, in fairness. So.
Okay. I mean, I have heard from work that's been done in AFBI in the north that I think, particularly on some of the wetter and maybe heavier ground, they found that agroforestry can increase those number of grazing days that you were talking about because it dries the ground out. But obviously, yeah, I don't think you'd have any experience of it. I might also add there that we are just starting some work in Johnstown Castle, in Athenry, and also in Ballyhaise, where we will be starting to look in more detail at some agroforestry options. But obviously, it's a long-term initiative to look at that. Elodie, there is a question here for you. Is there a downside to increasing the clover proportion in grass? It seems like a simple solution.
So I guess while it seems simple indeed to just say put clover in your grass, I guess it's not that easy. So we're starting to try to put clover in a lot of grass farm here. But the problem is just to have the clover starting to grow is a first challenge for the first year. It's not that sometimes it takes, sometimes it doesn't. So there can be a problem around that. And then there could be a problem around persistency. So it could be there for 1 or 2 years and then disappear. So that means you need to bring it back, and you need to have the proper grass management to be able to keep clover into the farm. So while it is a good solution, and I think it is one of the most important, better solution we'll have in the future, it's actually not that easy to implement on farms. So we need more research, and we need to keep working on trying to understand why sometimes does it work and when sometimes does it not work. So, yeah.
And again, as I understand it, Elodie, there's quite a lot of work starting on the subject of grass clover and also perhaps multi-species swards increasingly, and looking at them as alternatives to pure ryegrass swards.
Yeah. We are starting since, but that's the multi-species is really just starting. So I wouldn't feel very confident to give a lot of information about it because I don't actually have them. But in Curtin's farm, just there since 2 or 3 years, I think they're starting to put multi-species in. So it's coming, yeah. Okay.
And a question for you, Niall. Which type of land use have been afforested in recent years in private lands? And what is the trend? Only grasslands potentially will be converted into forestry, ?
Yeah, and in my presentation, I did break down the difference between state afforestation in the early part of the 20th century, which was confined actually to not be a competitor against agriculture, who actually was a price that you could actually pay for forest land, which was limited to £4 an acre. So it basically limited forestry land to a certain poor type of land. I think with the planting, the private planting, certainly a more diverse portfolio of land, minerals, soils. Certainly the peatland soils are no longer eligible for planting. There is this idea that peat, cultivating peat will emit carbon dioxide, and it's probably better off for a different land use. So we're primarily talking about mineral soils here. And again, look, the better type of soils you plant, the more options you have in terms of tree species. So there's dividends for higher quality land, higher quality tree, and again you get the dividends from that. But certainly there are a lot of regulations in place now with the new afforestation schemes with the Department of Agriculture, which in terms of habitats directive, etc. So the land that's being planted now is certainly and that's what I alluded to in my presentation, is more the mineral soils, grassland.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Another question here for you, Ewan. How open are farmers in Ireland to growing GM crops?
Okay, so it's a very good question. So we've done some surveys. One on potato growers as part of the Amiga project showed that over 60% of growers would grow it in the morning. But of course, that's in the context of the potential for it to reduce fungicide inputs. If you're a potato grower and you're spraying every week, for the high-end commercial growers, that's a huge cost, both labor, product, everything. So anything that's going to reduce that cost and improve margins is going to be welcomed. However, producing a product is one thing. You have to make sure there's a market for it. That's the other thing. So in regard to the GM, while producers may be willing to grow it and have a keen interest, there has to be a whole system look at this. So there has to be a balanced discussion really around the challenges we face if we're going to reduce our pesticide and fungicide use. Can we explore the use of alternative technologies to get there?
I suppose there's also a risk element to that as well, as there, Ewan, because you can often go 10 or 14 days here without getting any conditions on which you could apply a fungicide for controlling blight.
Yeah, and I mean that's the key thing as well. Like the weather patterns we have now, the window of opportunity to apply management practices is getting narrower and narrower. So and that can be very frustrating for farmers.
Okay, and I think we've time for maybe one more question. We'll squeeze one in, Ewan. You showed a map of the areas which had grown crops previously based on the name of the town's land. What was the area of crops that was grown at that time, and could all of that go back into production now?
So based on Jesco's work, it was just under 1 million hectares, from what I understand. Of course, oats would have been one of the dominant species back then that was grown as a biofuel, as I said earlier, for the horsepower. Can all of that go into crops? We have to consider the fact that a lot of that would have been subsistence farming. So relative to the mechanized commercial farming we have now, no, I think is the answer. We wouldn't be able to convert all of it. And I think listening to the other speakers on the call today, it's about diversification is key. But I think when we put up that graphic today was to show the potential that we have in terms of land use for crop productivity, be that tillage or horticulture across the island.
Yeah, I suppose there's the point that horticulture maybe isn't quite as restricted, particularly if it's in protected cropping as tillage farming might be.
Absolutely,
well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would like to thank our three presenters, Elodie, Niall, and Ewan. I'd also like to thank you for your time and for your questions, and to remind you that we have a further seminar on the issue of land use, which is in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of December at the same time, and there we'll be talking about getting the balance between land use in terms of the production that we've been talking about today, but also about in terms of the environmental demands that we make on land. So I'll look forward to seeing you all I won't see you, but talking to you all in 2 weeks' time. And I'll remind you that also the slides for today will be put up on the website. You'll be able to get them, or you'll be able to see a recording back of this, and you should be able to contact. There were some questions there in terms of the detail of some of the slides, but you should be able to contact the presenters and ask them those by email. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you again for your attendance. Bye.